Greetings, it is I, Tempest Narvan Dracovin, Lord and Emperor of the Dracovin Empire, and welcome. Today I'm going to talk about 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, 5th edition D&D. So in this one, I want to talk about these appendices at the back of the player's handbook. These are all important things. After this, I will be finished up with talking about things from the player's handbook. In the next episode, after this one, I'm announcing it now, I'm going to move on to talking about the monster manual in general and explaining to you a little bit to understand how it works, monster entries, that sort of thing. I will then move into a guide on being a GM and talking about things from the GM's guide. After I'm done those two, I'm not sure if I'm going to move into any other books or materials from Dungeons & Dragons. I'll see how things go from there to see about what I'm moving on to next. Anyway, let's for now dive into talking about the appendices. The first one talks about conditions. Conditions are an important thing to know about. Conditions are given by spells, effects, or creatures to whatever target it is. Whether you're the target or a monster's the target, it can get a condition. Conditions are usually harmful. They're impediments on your character, but not all of them. Some of them can actually act as bonuses to your character. They're effectively something small that you get, and you keep a condition until either something happens, such as, for example, if you're prone, standing up removes the condition, or a certain duration goes away. When that duration has ended, then it also goes away. Now, multiple of the same condition doesn't technically stack. Their durations will tell you how long each of them lasts, but they don't add together to make a more potent condition. You're just going to have the condition you had, period. Now, I'm not going to go into major details about all the conditions. I'm going to list them, and I'm going to give you like a word or two to tell you what the condition is to have you an idea of what it means. So most of them are pretty straightforward, so don't really need a lot of explanation from me. But if you want to see what these conditions do, just head to the appendices at the back of the book, and it will list all the bonus/penalties that you would get from having that condition. So the first one is blinded. You can't see. Simple as that. Next one is charmed. This means that some other creature has made you infatuated, in love with them. Next is deafened. You can't hear. Then there's frightened. You're scared of something. You're incredibly scared of something. Next is it's grappling. You're being held by something. Incapacitated. You're unable to do anything. Invisible. You're invisible. Things can't see you. Paralyzed. You're similar to incapacitated, except you'd be more aware of what's going on. You just can't move at all because you're paralyzed. Petrified. Return to stone. Poison. As is. Prone. You're lying on the ground. Restrained. Something's tied you up. Stunned. You've been like hit by something, and stunned is similar to incapacitated, paralyzed, except it's a much more temporary basis. Usually, it's like I'm stunned for a second. And unconscious is you're like asleep, unconscious. You're knocked out. It's like the next level of incapacity. When you're unconscious, you are incapacitated. So if you're talking about things which are making you not be able to do stuff, paralyzed, incapacitated, unconscious. Down the list. Now, last thing, there is a side note here on exhaustion. Exhaustion has different levels which have different effects, and the little side note on exhaustion tells you what kind of things can give you exhaustion. And as you get more and more exhaustion, it gets worse. So effectively, it would be like staying up long periods of time without sleeping. You might start getting levels of exhaustion, which would suck. Let's move on to the next appendices. Deities, the gods of Dungeons & Dragons. Now, all of the deities are listed in this book. Give the name of the deity, some suggested domains, the alignment of the deity, and the symbol of the deity. So you know, kind of like holy symbol you'd be holding up, whether it be something like a burning sun or a skull. Now, D&D has their own pantheons, has a couple of different ones based on the different worlds you can play in. These are the basic ones you're going to be using, and if your DM tells you we're set in blank world, you'll be able to easily reference these deities. Your DM may also either come up with their own deities or use any of these lists if they're going like a custom world. That's also a choice. Most of the time, most people use a setting and just set their adventures in it. But if you make a custom world, your DM can come up with the deities on their own and then give you the option of which one to choose from. Now, regardless, let's talk about the deities they list in the book, which are the ones that are example ones. Now, the first group of them come from a number of the campaign settings, the worlds that Dungeons & Dragons describes. Now, each of these worlds has been fleshed out with material from earlier editions that you can look at this material and learn a lot about these worlds. They've changed over the years And even now in 5th edition, many of them have information which has been put out for these worlds if you want to look into them. But you can also, again, look into that past material for more information. But rather than just diving into all these worlds, I'll give a little bit about information about each of them. The first one is Forgotten Realms. This is set in a world very similar to our own. Most of the stories take place in Faerun. They've got their own listing of a lot of deities. A lot of popular fiction from the Dungeons & Dragons universe is set in Forgotten Realms. It is one of the popular universes to use. After that is Greyhawk. This has a world set mostly on the continent of Auric. When we were talking about a lot of basic deities, most of the time they listed the ones from Greyhawk. Greyhawk was sort of the standard world used in a lot of D&D games. If we look back to 3rd edition, the deities they listed in the book for 3rd edition in the Player's Handbook were the Greyhawk deities. This one lists all of them, so you have a little bit more choice. But after that is Dragonlance. Dragonlance is set in the world of Kryn. Now, it's another system. It's got its own mythologies and stuff. And the last one I do want to mention is Eberron, which is actually one of the newer ones. It was originally released in 3rd edition, while the other ones are older towards AD&D or before. But regardless, Eberron's another one. And the book will list the deities, the main deities for all 4 of these worlds. Now, this also lists the non-human deities. Now, most of these deities before are the ones that humans mostly worship, but a lot of the other races will worship them too. But there are specifically deities that humans tend not to worship, or very rarely. They're ones that are very unusual for humans to get into. Granted, they can, but it's unusual. They're the non-human deities. These oftentimes go in between these different worlds. For example, the entire listing here is fairly spot on, but between Forgotten Realms and Dragonlance. They're going to be very similar, but these deities might appear in Dragonlance or Eberron. It's just they would have different doctrines to a degree. They alter little things about how these deities work in these other worlds if they are in them. Now, the last thing the book lists for deities is deities from historical pantheons of our own world. You can use these if you want. These are deitic pantheons that are traditionally seen as like the ancient deities that a lot of us have heard about a bunch of these, and again, you can use them all you want. This is the Celtic deities, the Egyptian deities, the Greek deities, and of course the Norse deities, the pantheons of all of these. You can use them in your game as an option if you want to use one of these pantheons. Granted, you could also bring them into any of the other worlds. Next, I want to talk about the planes. Oh, the planes. This is a very interesting one to talk about. This talks about the multiverse as a whole. Most of your adventures are more than likely going to take place on the material plane. Think of that as the world your characters are in most of the time. It's where they're born, where they know about, whatever campaign setting it is. It's their world. Like if you're in Forgotten Realms and in the land of Faerun, then you're in Faerun. That's your part of the material plane. The material plane extends beyond that. It's got like entire cosmologies and things like that, but you start with that. Now after that, when we're talking about the multiverse and going beyond the plane, we talk about the material plane echoes. This would be the Shadowfell, or plane of shadows, and the Feywild, or the plane of fairies. These, when you're in these worlds, they look like shadows of our own planes, or echoes of our own plane. It looks a lot like that. You'll find familiar things in these worlds, except they are still alien and different. That's why they're shadows of it. Now I do want to quickly mention that over all the planes I will mention from here on out, there are the positive and negative energy planes. These like sort of exist over everything, almost as a shell over everything. They represent a lot of like the radiant healing sort of energies and the sort of dark inflicting damage sort of energies, the negative energies. And I kind of will explain a little bit more when I'm getting towards the outer planes. But for now, let's talk about planar travel, because there's a lot of different ways to travel in planes. Some of them are specifically for certain types of planes. Others, you would have to have like powerful spells, like a plane shift, or you have to find gates to them in a world. Oftentimes there are gates to these places. When we talk about traveling in between planes, we have to talk about the transitive planes. There's 2 of them, the ethereal plane and the astral plane. You have specific spells that can cause you to travel in these transition planes, and they're often very desolate and empty because they're made for sort of transition, traveling. Like, depending on the spell you're using, you might not know you're traveling through it, or it might be instantaneous, but it's effectively the space in between the planes is represented by them. After this, we have to talk about the inner planes. The inner planes, when we really talk about them, we're talking about the elemental planes. Earth, fire, wind, water. the planes of these elements. Those are the inner plane. After that, we want to talk about the outer planes. The outer planes, there are 16 of them listed in the book, and they kind of go on this wheel, almost, that you can almost see it representing the 9 alignments with things in between them a little bit, because there's the upper planes, which represent good, lower planes, which represent evil or have like evil tendencies. There's chaotic planes to the one side and lawful planes to the other side, and it makes this kind of circle that you have 16 planes really, so you have a transitive effect of going, like, if you start at the most chaotic point and start moving towards the top of good, you get more and more neutral while you stay good around that thing. And then you're getting less good and more lawful until you're totally lawful. And you're getting less lawful and more evil until you get too full, and so back and so forth, circling around the outer plane. These are often represented or represent and exist because of the raw energies of the, multiverse, of existence, are represented in many of these outer planes. Now, there are other things other than this cosmology. There are other locations. We can talk about Sigil in the Outlands. The Outlands is another transitive area that exists in between all the outer planes, except rather than representing the nothingness of having none of them, it represents a little bit of all of them. And Sigil is the city at the heart of it. It is like the planar metropolis is the best way to describe it. It exists because there is travel to and from between planes there, and it is the largest city you could probably ever go to. Ever. Now, after that, we want to talk about demi-planes. Demi-planes are smaller planes within their own rules that exist sort of outside of all of these other planes, but within the same cosmology. This could be something like your Ravenloft. If you're playing the Curse of Strahd adventure that Wizards put out, you're set in Ravenloft. It's a demi-plane. It's another plane of existence, but it's a much smaller one with its own rules. Now, beyond that, there's also the Far Realm. The Far Realm is sort of representing everything beyond the scope of this entire thing I've been talking about. It is the alien and unknown outside there. It is oftentimes insane and chaotic and may represent its own material existence or something else entirely, and whatever you as a creature set in this multiverse, in this material plane from it and in the multiverse around it, going into the Far Realm, you may not be able to comprehend it with your mind. It might drive it insane because of how different and alien it actually is. Now, lastly, I do want to briefly bring up that the book has a number of creatures in it. These creatures are some of the basic things you can fight against. There are a bunch of animals, a couple of monsters. They just gives a basic listing of them. It tells you their CR. It's a lot of lower level stuff. I'm not going to go into major details about this because I want to save it for when I'm talking about the monster manual, about how you can understand the entries on these creatures and kind of figure out how to use them in your adventure. So I will talk about that next time, but just know there is a listing of creatures in the book. So even if you don't have a monster manual, you can still use a couple of creatures and use them in your adventures. But I'll explain that with monster manual next episode. So that's it for today. I went over the appendices. In here I talked about conditions. I talked about pantheons and all the deities. I talked about the planes. And of course, I talked about just a tiny bit about creatures, just mentioning that they're in the book. I'll talk about them more next week. So if you have any questions, comments, anything you want to say, anything you think I left out, please leave in the comments below. Please like this video. It shows your support for the channel, the Empire, for the work I do. Please subscribe if you already haven't. We're always looking for more citizens or members. And please share this video. If you know anybody who will learn from it or would just enjoy watching it, please share it with them. And until next time, I bid you farewell.